My guest is Jeff Smulyan. He is the CEO of Emmis Communications. He's the author of the book Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down: The Ups, Downs, and Reinvention of an Entrepreneur. Jeff is one of the founding fathers of sports radio. He started WFAN in New York City. He owned the Seattle Mariners from 1989 to 1992. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me on Sports Business Radio. How are you?
I'm great, Brian. Good to join you.
All right, let's start with this. You are an entrepreneur. You have reinvented yourself many times. What makes for a good entrepreneur?
I think number one, surround yourself with great people. I've been fortunate. Have a passion for what you do. I think it's very, very important to make sure you create a collaborative culture where people are willing to walk in to you and say, I think you're wrong. I see that a lot where a lot of entrepreneurs become successful and they think I got all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. I've always said when I speak to college kids, I always say the most important thing to do in the world is go out and fail. Cause we all do. When I was a college kid, I thought, well, the success is just a straight line up and everything is perfect. And that's not life. That's why I named the book Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down. Cause a lot of times I always said life's a roller coaster. And my career has been so crazy, I've ridden it upside down a few times. So, but I think it's what you learn after you fail, that really is the measure of your success in your life.
What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned from failure?
I think the most important thing is be persistent, never quit. Look at different ways of doing something. I think the most important thing is if you love something, you'll keep at it. And it will get you through the tough times. But I think, with failure, you learn the great lessons of life. I always said we did much better work during hard times and good times. When things are good, you're successful. It's like, yeah, I got this, no problem. When things are bad, it's like, okay, how do I reinvent myself? How do I solve this problem?
Let me ask you this. Failure working for someone else is one thing. Failure as an entrepreneur could make you risk averse. How do you stay so you're not risk averse?
But, I always laugh. I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. My father was an entrepreneur. My grandfather's an entrepreneur. So it was sort of in my blood. When I got out of college, I was going to get a master's in telecom. I went to USC, which is probably not a name that anybody likes in Portland these days, but that's another story. And somebody said, go get a law degree. If you want to be an entrepreneur, go get a law degree. And I always laugh. I became a lawyer. I studied, wrote my law review article in the FCC. And in those days, everybody said, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you got to get a law degree, got to be a lawyer. Today, if you asked 100 people, they said, well, get an MBA. But in those days, it was like, nah, you don't get an MBA. And I laugh. If I had gotten an MBA, I probably would have understood the concept of risk and never would have been an entrepreneur. Because people always say to me, how did you start with nothing and everything you had, you saved and you borrowed, put in the company? I said, I don't know. I believed in myself, and I did it.
I love it. All right. Sports radio. You saw this before anyone saw it coming. What did you see that made you say, let me start WFAN, and this is a format that could grow to what, 500 or 600 stations in the US right now?
Yeah. It's funny. I had the idea for all sports radio when I was not paying attention to class at USC, which was a very common occurrence for me. And years later, the company was growing. We specialized in FM music stations, and we bought the last 3 Doubleday stations. And the AM was our first AM, and it was in New York City. It was the largest country music station in America at the time, although that just meant it was about the 40th rated station in New York because there aren't that many country listeners in New York. And I said, look, I think all music's going to end up on FM. So I think what we need to do is think about this idea. And I mentioned to our people, we had a managers meeting, it got voted down. And finally they came in the next day and said, look, we think it's a stupid idea, but it's your baby. We'll do it. We owe you one. The company's doing really well. And for the first year and year and a half, it was a disaster. And I have a favorite saying in life: the line between being a genius and an idiot is very fine. And I've been on both sides many times. And one chapter of the book is Idiot to Genius, which is WFAN. And then the next chapter is Genius to Idiot, which is the Seattle Mariners. But it was Jim Lampley called it the Vietnam War of Emmis. It was known as Smulyan's Folly. Um, I'll never forget, after about a year, the station was not doing well. We bought the NBC stations. And in those days, you could only own one AM and one FM. So we decided to move the WFAN from its 1050 frequency to 660. And we were inheriting Don Imus. We could pick up his contract, who was on WNBC. And I'll never forget, I met with his agent, a wonderful guy named Mike Lynn, and we were debating what to do. And I said, let me see if I get this right. We carried the Mets, excuse me, by 1988. I think it was well known the Mets had developed a lot of players with big drug problems. We had a radio station losing record amounts of money, and we had Don Imus, who had spent the last 5 years in and out of rehab. So I said, we got the Mets with drug problems, the station losing a lot of money, and we've got Don Imus, who has had a history of his own substance abuse. What could possibly go wrong by putting all these things together? But we put them together, and it was magic. Don never had another substance problem in his life. And the station turned around. We put Mike and the Mad Dog on, and then it became one of America's most iconic stations. And so I went from idiot to genius on that project. And people always say to me, did you envision 600-700 radio stations doing all sports? And I said, I couldn't even envision one doing all sports after the first year.
I mean, didn't you think, wow, will people sit around 24/7, 365 and talk about sports? Wasn't that something that you were like, is there enough content to fill a 24-hour cycle?
It was always the question. Well, we wanted Imus. We wanted Imus before we, when we first put the station on the air. Greg Gumbel was our first morning man, but we wanted Imus because he had a crossover audience. A lot of males liked him. He talked about, politics, and he talked about sports, and he talked about everything. So we thought you could cross over that a little bit better than just all sports in the morning. It's funny. It changed everything. I'll tell you a funny story. When I got into baseball, all sports radio, because there became a market for it and people could talk about it, it really changed the nature of the relationship between players and owners and fans. And it used to be, if you were an owner, you were a player, you were a manager, and somebody, ripped you in the newspaper, you read the column at 8 in the morning, you put it down, and that was it. But with all sports radio, you could get attacked 24/7. So it really did change the nature. Most people in sports management, ownership, and players might tell you it changed it for the worse. Funny story, a few years later, I'm in Seattle, and I own the Mariners, and one of my dear friends, who was another owner, was in Seattle, and he's driving around town, and he's listening to me as the owner of the Mariners and the inventor of the format getting attacked by one of the hosts. And he said, I'm not a religious man, but to think that the guy who invented this format that ruined all of our lives, is now an owner and getting ripped by the format he created proves to me there's a God. So it did change everything.
It was ironic, right?
Very ironic. Yes.
You've worked with, like you said, Imus, Mike and the Mad Dog, David Letterman. I mean,
Yep.
some really iconic broadcasters.
Yeah.
What makes for a compelling talk show host?
Somebody who really has a feel for the communities in, somebody who really has a relationship with people, somebody who can feel the pulse of its market, and whether it's local or national, somebody who relates to his or her listeners.
What do you think about this? As we've seen sports radio grow and, the TV networks grow, there wasn't an ESPN back then. People laughed and said, you can't put a sports network on TV for
Yep.
24/7,
Yep.
365 and have people
Yep.
watch out. There's not enough to show. But what's happened
Yes.
is the media people have become as much of a part of the story as the people they're covering.
Absolutely right.
And
Absolutely
there's
right.
there's old schoolers who go, well, cover the person you're covering and let them be the story.
Yeah.
Don't you, as the media person, be the story. But I know, there's a lot of successful people who have
Yeah.
made
You are the story.
themselves the story.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there was a big debate a few years ago when they paid, I think Al Michaels got $15 million a year, and Joe Buck and Troy Aikman got whatever it was. And people say, how can this be? And the answer is that, we also love our personalities. I'm not
Mhm.
sure that a play-by-play announcer is going to make, a Colts, Texans game in December compelling. Of course, they would, you wouldn't have Joe Buck and Troy Aikman on that game anyway. But I think having great personalities. Peyton Manning tells a story about the fact that when his grandfather knew that John Madden was covering his game, it was a big game.
Mhm.
So there's no question personalities make a big difference.
When you see something like the Manning cast,
Yeah.
do you say that's the future, or is that an anomaly that can only be pulled off by Peyton and Eli?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm a big Peyton fan. I've known him here from Indianapolis for a long time. There's no question his personality and his interplay with Eli has given them, a certain amount of cachet that is going to be hard to duplicate. I know they're trying it in baseball. They're trying it in some other things. Um, I still think that most people are still going to want to watch the play-by-play. You know,
All right, let's talk about your time with the Mariners. You alluded to
okay,
this earlier. It was a little bumpy. It
yeah,
wasn't the ideal run from,
yeah,
what was it, 1989 to
yeah.
1992.
Yeah.
What made it so bumpy?
Well, but basically, and I've always said I think the job. It's funny because I was with Senator Cantwell just today, and Maria was a U.S. senator in those days was a state senator. She's a big baseball fan, and she talked about how we really, and this is something I've always been proud of. We really marketed and created at least an entity that people cared about. I don't think we really understood the relationship between baseball and the community. I think our people did a great job of marketing and creating a winning atmosphere. But we just didn't have the money. I joked, we couldn't afford to lose $15-20 million a year. Right after we got in, we got hit with a $12 million collusion payment. We never got a TV contract. So I always joked at the time, to own the Mariners in the days before revenue sharing, you really needed to be a billionaire.
Mm.
But if you owned the Yankees or the Dodgers and you had a paper route, you'd be okay.
Yeah.
So, I was not capable of funding those kind of losses in those days.
Do you think it's easier to own a baseball team today than it was back then because of the revenue sharing, because of the money that's coming in from the media deals and such?
Yeah, it is. Although what's happened to valuations has just been crazy. The economics, teams are profitable now, but you've had so many billionaires who bid up values that,
Right.
the Phoenix Suns sold for $4 billion. And a team that maybe makes 30-40 million dollars a year. Well, there's no way that can ever be a viable business investment. But if you're Matt and you've got, 9-10 billion dollars, what the heck? $6 billion for the Redskins. So the valuations have grown almost independent of the business. The businesses have gotten better. And the NFL, by the way, is the world's best business. That's a great business. But baseball and basketball are now nominally profitable. In some markets, they're more than that. But they don't bear any relationship to the prices that they've been valued at. That's merely a function of being bid up by, I always said the difference between then and now is in 1989, we may have had 50 billionaires. Today we have 1,000 billionaires.
Right.
And that's really changed the dynamic of the economics of sports.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had a lot of owners on the show, and
Yeah.
Part of the cachet is you're buying something that only a very few number of people can buy, right? You're in the
Yeah,
club.
absolutely right. You're in the
So
club.
they know they're going to lose money or break even at best, but
Yeah,
they've got entry into the club. This is something they
right.
can keep in their family. I mean, Matt Ishby has already said, the new owner of the Suns, he's like, I'll never sell this team. This will stay in my
Yeah,
family for as long as, my family's alive and the
yeah,
generations are alive. So some people buy it for that reason too. Cause
right.
again, it's just one of those things that not many
Yeah,
people can get their hands on. But do you think you have
yeah.
to go into it today going, all right, we're in the club, but we're not going to make money doing this?
Yeah, you can't justify the purchase prices. In the NFL, you can make 250, $300 million a year, a little bit more of a bigger franchise. But we used to value most assets, broadcast assets at 10 times. Well, even if you make $250 million, and you multiply it by 10 times, that's $2.5 billion. There are no baseball teams and no basketball teams making that kind of money. So, would the chance, so let's see you know, the Phoenix Suns. So Matt would have to make $400 million to make it a 10 times purchase. I don't think you're ever going to see a time. So the team can be profitable, but it can't service the debt. But if you come in and you pay all cash, $4 billion, and you don't have to have a return on that investment, you'll be fine.
Yeah. Although the media rights keep going up and up and up, right? For the
Yeah,
NBA and
yeah,
the NFL, not really for anyone else, but the
yeah.
NFL and the NBA, those rights are skyrocketing.
Ye They have been unbelievable. In the NFL, I love the NBA, but the NFL really is the one. I mean, you are getting, probably each team will get $425 million a year with a new TV deal. That is hard to replicate anywhere else. I think the NBA is probably gonna, that they hope to double. I think they're $3 billion a year, maybe 6 or 7. But the NFL's at 15. So again, hard to know. But I would tell you that there are also storms clouds on the horizon. Over the air TV is struggling a lot.
Mhm.
The great growth of the over the air networks has been because of retransmission consent. That is based on, it was based originally on 105 million people paying, you know, um, the networks a couple bucks a month. We're now down to, I think, 65 million people and declining. I always said that, and I hope I don't get too far in the weeds, but maybe this example is the best way to describe it. Somebody said, describe the economics of sports. And I said, sports has really been having everybody pay for what 30% of the population um, cares about.
Hmm.
And I gave the example of an 85-year-old grandmother in Pasadena. And she's had the cable bundle forever, and she's paying her $130 a month. And out of that $130 a month, she's paying $10 a month for ESPN and $6 a month for the Dodgers and $5 a month for the Lakers and $4 a month for the Angels and the Kings and the Pac-12. So she's paying $30 a month for sports. She doesn't know the Dodgers left Brooklyn. And the problem with that is that has been the heart of sports. When everybody pays for what some people care about, that's what led to the monstrous growth in sports valuations.
Yeah.
But as that breaks apart, now everybody's scrambling. As you know, Bally Sports
Mhm.
is in bankruptcy, and the question is there a way to replicate that model just on a direct to consumer basis? And the problem is, and I've lived this, ESPN is wrestling away with it again. If only 30% of the population cares about, Indiana Pacer basketball, but 100% of the population's on cable and they're paying for it. If they come off of cable and the Pacers have to go direct or Bally has to go to direct to the consumer, how much they have to pay? Most people are saying it's $20 a month. I think the Red Sox started at $30 a month. Problem is that that's a very steep price. And that, really, really narrows down the number of people who are going to pay. So
Yeah.
nobody has been able to crack the code on making that math work.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. I mean, you see what
Yeah.
the streaming services have done, which,
Yeah.
those are all direct to consumer.
Right.
Netflix, Apple,
Right.
Max,
Right.
everyone. And, people have wanted a la carte for a long time. They haven't
Right.
wanted to pay for things that they're not using.
Right.
But
Right.
you wonder, how are the sports entities going to stay alive? And
Well, that's the question. The question is, is if you said that the Indiana Pacers had 1 million people paying $5 a month for their cable rights, and all of a sudden the cable bundle drops down to 300,000 people a month, then all of a sudden, how do you reach those other 700,000 people? And how many of those 700,000 people will pay not $5 a month, but maybe $20 a month to
Mhm,
watch the Indiana Pacers and the Trailblazers? You know,
right. Yeah. All right. I want to talk about the future of sports radio, because
okay,
I'll tell you my path. I started this as AM radio in 2004, sports business radio. First guest was the late Commissioner David Stern. And
I adore David.
so did I. He was a mentor and a very good friend, and, always honored that he was my first ever guest. So we
If you,
started, go ahead.
as if you read my book, you'll find out that one of my great career mistakes was David offered me the Rockets when I got out of baseball, and I turned him down. It's a long story, but you have to read the book.
Okay.
But David was very kind to me. We worked on all sorts of TV stuff. And
Yeah.
a matter of fact, one of my favorite stories, David called me one day at the end of our tenure in Seattle, and he said, I have a bet with somebody. He said, here's the bet. I bet somebody, the question was, if you were offered the Seattle Mariners today for free, and the only two conditions were you had to stay in Seattle for 10 years and the economics of baseball couldn't change, would you take the team for free? And I instantly laughed and said, no, David, because I said, in 10 years, your free baseball team would have cost you $500 million. And I said, and that doesn't deal with the psychic cost of beating your head against the wall every day in fighting some of the politicians. So he laughed. He said, I knew that's what you'd say. But
Yeah.
I love David. Wonderful guy, and may he rest in peace.
Yeah. He was a visionary. I mean, two of you
Yeah.
together having these conversations, that's two visionaries getting together.
We had a
Yeah.
lot of fun.
Yeah.
Lot of fun.
So this started as AM radio. Then we went to
Right.
satellite radio. Then in 2013, I think it is, we went full podcasting, because
Yeah.
I hated taking commercial breaks every 10 minutes and having a
Yep.
guest wait on hold on the phone.
I
And
understand.
like I did in 2016, I sat down for 90 minutes in New York in front of a studio audience with David, and he
Yep.
told stories that were unbelievable. And there's no parameters of a podcast like there is
Yep.
with radio.
Yep.
Everyone has a podcast now. I mean, it's
Yep.
just funny. I feel like I'm one of the pod fathers starting
Yep.
in, 2004. Um,
Yep.
So with all of that being said, and, we see that radio's importance has definitely declined in the last
Yeah.
several years.
Yeah.
And, your people who are doing big podcasts, they're not going to radio to do them. They're going to the podcast format to do
Right.
that. Is podcasting going to be the dominant form of talk audio going forward, or is radio still going to have a place in people's lives?
Well, radio will have a place in people's lives. And of course, we've sort of voted with our feet. I love the business more than anybody, but we have sort of sold everything but our last two stations. I leased one to ESPN, and when that lease is up, we've said we will sell it.
Mm-hmm.
It is a business that will always have, a place because it's significant in the car. It's free. The distribution cost is very, very minor. Radio has really suffered death by 1,000 cuts, whether it was streaming audio, whether it was satellite radio, now it's podcasting. So it doesn't go away. It just gets a little smaller every day. And podcasting clearly, it resonates. The challenge with podcast, as you know, is the economics. Can you get enough people subscribing or sell enough ads? I always say all of life's a math question. If the math
Mhm.
works, all is well. If it doesn't work, then it's a tougher challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people out there, though, that are actors,
Yeah.
who have a lot of money, who don't care if they make
Yes.
any money doing a podcast.
Well, that's
And
my first question to college is are you getting into a business or a hobby?
Right.
A lot of things are hobbies. They're never going to make any money. Now, if you need to feed your family, you make sure it's a business.
Yeah. That's really good. All right. I want to go back to the Mariners for a minute because you pulled
Sure.
something off with the Mariners that
Yeah.
we've never seen and we may never see again. Ken Griffey Sr. and Jr.
Right.
And Junior has been on this show with me. And, I think the world of him. And I've lived in the Pacific Northwest for a long time. So I saw him in his heyday. But what was it like bringing father and son together on that team?
It was wonderful. That was, matter of fact, there were very few pictures and mementos. I say, I'm in my office at home tonight, and somewhere here is the lineup card that they both signed.
Wow.
First night ever. One, and I have a picture on my desk. I'm not a big memento guy.
Yeah. That's a big one, though.
But I have a picture on my desk. I was a kid who grew up uh, idolizing Willie Mays, and I have a picture from spring training with Ken Jr. and Senior Willie Mays that's one picture I saved.
Yeah.
Junior was the best. I loved Junior. I loved his dad. Being able to put them together, one of the great memories of all time.
Yeah. Well, and when they went back to back home runs in a game, that was like
actually,
fairy tale.
that was I think it was in Anaheim. I was at a broadcast convention, and we were in a bar late at night after meetings, and we were in the bar, and oh my gosh, the Mariners game's on, and I'm sitting there watching with friends, and they went back to back, and it was like, oh my God, this is just heaven. One of the, cause it was a road game, and I wasn't at the game, but I happened to see it on TV, but, being there when they started, obviously I was in Seattle for all of that, and wonderful.
Yeah. All right. Your book. Why did you write it? What do you hope people take away from reading your book?
Well, I wrote it at the behest of my daughter, who's now just finished her freshman year at Georgetown. I would drive her to school every day.
I love Georgetown, by the way.
Yeah, it's a great place. Even though I'm a big USC guy, as a matter of fact, I think you can see the sign in my office, Trojans Forever up there.
Yeah.
People couldn't see that, but,
Yeah.
and I've been an undergraduate law school at SC. I've been on the board of trustees for 20 some years, but I love how happy she is at Georgetown. But I would drive her to school every day from kindergarten until she fired me. She got her driver's license in high school. But we would just talk about life. And one day she said, Dad, nobody would ever believe these stories. Yeah, I'm a big lesson guy. Here's what I learned here. So the book hopefully is a lot of very, very funny stories. I think the most gratifying thing is the response of people who've read it. They think it's funny, and they came away learning a lot of fun stuff. So it's the most, gratifying thing I've ever done. Cause I've heard from people everywhere, how much fun they had reading and how much they learned. So I hope people learn some important lessons in life. That's what I hope.
That's great. All right, let's end on this. You've been around radio and broadcasting for a long time. I know I have my inspirations, people who have inspired me in this industry. Who are the top 3 or 4 people who have inspired you in the broadcast industry? It could be on air or behind the scenes.
Well, I think most of the people who inspired me are my peers. I started with a guy named John Dilley. I look at some of the early pioneers of the industry, who came before me. I just adore them. The John Fetzers of the world who own the Tigers. Some of the people, at WGN, the Cap Cities people, that I adored. I had one mentor in sports who's been really probably of my mentors. It's Jerry Reinsdorf. Jerry has been a big brother to me.
Interesting. Wow.
For 30 years. We kid all the time. I adore him. As a matter of fact, he has one of the liner notes. We have this fun relationship. I think the quote is, Jeff Smulyan is the kindest person I've ever met, the smartest person I've ever met, and the funniest person I've ever met, except for every other person I've ever met. I mean, that kind of sums up our relationship. I love Jerry. And I've had so many peers in the industry from all over, from CBS and the Clear Channel, the Mays family, and a friend named Bud Walder. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on.
What was David Letterman early 70s like?
David was brilliant. David was a weekend weatherman. When we hired him, we had mutual friends. We're the exact same age. David is 5 days younger than me. It was fun because the station was catering to an older audience. It was a talk station, 65 plus typical listeners. And here's David and me. We're both 25-year-old guys. And it was kind of hilarious. David would do all sorts of stuff. I've told a couple stories where one day I came back from lunch and a guy called me and said, "You got a communist on the air." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Letterman's a communist." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I called him and I said, look, I know there are communists in Carmel, Indiana." And I asked Letterman, "What are you going to do about it?" And Letterman said, "I think you got to give the communist Carmel. The football team's lousy. The traffic is always a mess. You can never find a parking place. So let's give them Carmel and hold the line at the next suburb." That was the kind of stuff David. And David did, I've told the story about, one day he said, "The city of Indianapolis has traded the monument in the center of town to Guam for a 300-foot stick of celery." And people were calling, saying, "Oh my God, you can't get rid of the monument." And David said, "Look, we need more greenery downtown. That celery stick will look good." He just did all sorts of stuff. Brilliant, funny. We've stayed in touch. David went on my board for a while when they dedicated the Letterman building at Ball State. The university asked me to give the keynote speech, and it was probably the worst decision I ever made. They said, "We want you to speak for 20 minutes before Dave goes on." And I said, when I got up to speak, I found out like the day before there were going to be 35,000 people. So I called the president of the university and I said, "If I speak for 20 minutes while they're waiting for Dave, they'll kill me." And I remember getting up saying, there's 35,000 people here, and not one person in this crowd, including my own wife, wants to hear me. But I promised the president I'd give you a keynote. So here we go. But David was
Oh my
brilliant,
God.
just brilliant. Yeah.
There's something about theater of the mind in the audio format too, don't you
Yeah.
think?
Absolutely, positively.
Yeah.
Absolutely, positively. And it's always been my first love. I think it broke my heart that we moved on. We're doing other things now. But I love the business. And I think it was always a chance to be so much more inventive. We had so much fun. We sort of invented modern hip hop radio and all sports and the variation of, top 40 and album rock. So we just had so much fun.
Jeff Smulyan, the author of the book Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down, the ups, downs, and reinvention of an entrepreneur. You, my friend, have done many amazing things in your life. It is a pleasure to be able to speak with you. Thanks for joining me on Sports Business Radio.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure. It's a lot of fun.